So Blizzard just committed what's professionally known as an oopsie. Basically, every class has been nerfed across the board, and several of the stats that made most builds possible have been significantly reduced as a result. Some classes have it worse than others, but rogues still somehow manage to get on the other side of the nerf hammer with only a few bruises and some missing teeth, at least all things considered. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We're looking at about a third of our damage being reduced, maybe a bit higher, depending how much your build focused on vulnerable damage, which, let's be honest, if you are a rogue, probably quite a lot. But specifically, we'll focus on the penetrating shot build, which overall feels weaker, but still probably can push fairly high in Nightmare Dungeons compared to some of the other classes that have been nerfed even more. Now, looking at the patch notes, our biggest nerfs don't even come from the class changes, but actually from the reduction in our most important stats. So this includes vulnerable damage, which has been reduced by 40%, and critical strike damage, which has been reduced by 17% across the board. However, these two numbers right here are a bit misleading, and actually they go much higher than that on specific gear pieces that, rogues use the most in all of their builds. Because if you read a few lines down, you will see that the critical strike damage that is inherited on the swords, so the one above the line, this has been reduced by around 50%, and the vulnerable damage, which is inherited on the crossbows, so also above the line, has actually been reduced by 65%. So just to show you how that looks like in game, in case of this sword, it's exactly the same one as before the patch. If you look above the line, the critical strike damage is now only 10.5%, which previously was 26%, give or take. Equally, if we look at the crossbow, it was previously 60% vulnerable damage above the line, now it's only 21%. Now, it does even up a little bit with the fact that the remaining affixes and gear pieces are only getting reduced by 17%. Plus, there are a few stat increases here that might help offset these and might, require a bit of a change here on the build. Physical damage has been increased. Also, shadow damage and non-physical damage, which are pretty okay if you go with an imbuement build. And damage with ranged weapons, plus a few more on top. So these might help offset some of these nerfs, but more testing is needed. However, another significant, nerf over here too is the damage reduction stats, which of course all classes relied on in high-level Nightmare Dungeons. These have been reduced by about 20 to 25% across the board. So you will feel overall squishier than ever before in high-level Nightmare Dungeons, which means two things. Either you have to play much better or just drop a few levels in the Nightmare Dungeons. For this penetrating shot build, this isn't going to be that big of a difference as before, because generally speaking, you're kind of shooting everything from really far away, so way before enemies would even reach you. So the damage reduction on the stats actually doesn't affect this particular build as much as it could have, at least not compared to maybe something like the twisting blades, which is constantly in melee range. So let's get started with the items and some of the aspects that kinda get shifted around a little bit. Umbra's aspect is going to be one of the most important with this build, given how we constantly generate those damage mitigation orbs that also increase movement speed or crit chance depending which upgrade you picked. However, if you find yourself not generating enough of those as it is on the pants, you can just change to it on the amulet and have a 70 to 80% chance to do so, which might be much better. Also, aspect of the disobedience got a major nerf, so that now it increases our armor by only up to 30% instead of 50% how it was previously, which is why something like aspect of might becomes even more important now to use. That's why I'm placing this on the helmet, so that we get a 20% damage reduction when we use basic skills. Since we use puncture all the time to build combo points anyway, this means we have a very high, almost constant uptime on this buff. In terms of the boots, we went with the Ravager's aspect so that we get 2 instances of the Shadow Step, a much better way to break CC and not get any stuns or freezes. Now, in terms of the damage ones, obviously Edge Master is going to continue to be on our crossbow to maximize damage. Also, the trick shot aspect, like I said, this can be changed from the amulet and be put either on the ring, gloves, or one of the swords, but it's going to continue to be useful for the fact that it splits our penetrating shot and helps us a ton with the damage. You're only losing like 10% damage on it, and even that is only on the splinters, and it's not really that big. In terms of the others, aspect of the expectant is going to help us with the combo point system. It's increasing our core skill damage at 3 combo points, plus it synergizes very well with condemnation, which does pretty much the same, buffing that damage at 3 combo points. Otherwise, we're using aspect of the corruption so that our imbuement skills have increased potency against vulnerable enemies. This includes damage with those imbuement skills too. And finally, for the gloves, I went with the rapid aspect so that our basic skills have better attack speed. This just helps a bit to build combo points faster or debuff enemies. So let's go over the skill tree. There are a few changes here and a bigger focus on some abilities that help us survive for longer but also provide some additional utility. In terms of our main skills, Puncture is obviously going to still be there. It's an amazing combo point builder, also slows enemies and applies vulnerable debuff. Core skill is still going to be Penetrating Shot, but in this case you can move from the improved version to the advanced upgrade so that you can also knock down elite enemies. As I've said, damage mitigation has been reduced in the new update, so damage prevention like this one could come in a lot more handy. If enemies cannot reach you, they cannot hit you, so that's the best form of just reducing damage. However, in terms of other damage reductions or while survivability as a whole, Siphoning Strike has seen the biggest nerf of them all, and specifically I believe now it's a third of the healing that it used to provide. It's essentially a chance to trigger a chance for you to heal when you perform critical strikes. There was a moment in which we used this to heal in case enemies got too close to us or we didn't have enough damage, and this could help a bit to heal up, but this is going to significantly affect melee builds, not so much the Penetrating Shot, and we have even more reasons to completely drop it off now. In terms of our utility, we went with the Shadow Step again, maybe even more important now so that we can disengage and break from stun and CC and whatnot. Also, Weapon Mastery obviously going forward is still going to be an important passive. Concussive can be a lot more important now since we can knock back enemies, we gain additional critical strike, and since we knock down elites with Penetrating Shot, it could help with that, plus the traps that we're going to be using. Now, for the next category, the Subterfuge, obviously Dark Shroud becomes even more important now, and even investing points up until either countering for additional critical strike chance or subverting for additional movement speed is worth it. Even though we're not actively using this on the skill bar, this is important to be invested into because the Umbrous aspect triggers this as well as whatever upgrades it might have. That is why I invested a few points in it. Otherwise, Poison Trap here is even more important now. It's going to help us even more to keep enemies at bay, but also to reset our imbuement skills with the countering poison upgrade. Outside of that, obviously, Exploits and the Malice help a bit more with damage against healthy, injured enemies and also the ones made vulnerable. In terms of our imbuments, now there's actually a case to be made in splitting this between Shadow and Poison, but for now I just kept it with the Shadow imbuement because otherwise I don't have enough skills on the skill bar. Invested all points in it, and this is going to be our main damage dealer explosion against large groups of enemies. You could switch to Poison imbuement if you're fighting bosses, like I said. So if you go with this one, you'll also aim for the Consuming Shadow so that you can generate more energy as you destroy enemies with the shadow damage. For the ultimate, Death Trap, again, very good utility, keeps enemies in, far away from you, also provides decent damage, and with the Exposure key passive, you essentially reset your other traps too, so this means more chances to reset your imbuments as well. Plus the grenades and extra damage here helps too. Everything else here remains pretty much unchanged, so yeah, we still use Trap Mastery for the additional critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies, crowd control, then pretty much everything after we activated Poison or Death Trap. And the remaining Innervation, Aftermath, and the Adrenaline Rush just help us more with our energy regen problems. Obviously, we're still using this build with combo points, which is going to be the top specialization we pick with it, given how many buffs we get damage out of it. Now, going over the Paragon boards, not much has changed here, and in fact, we kind of have one buff here to one of the glyphs, specifically Combat, which I'm using on the first board. instead of only affecting core skills, now affects your entire build. So it's now a straight up critical strike damage increase. Plus, it was previously useful for critical strikes to additionally restore more of our energy cost. In terms of the second Paragon board, we have No Witness with the exploit. It just helps to increase damage against vulnerable, and it also helps spread that debuff to more enemies. Plus, with the rare nodes like the Ruin and the Knowledge, we further increase our damage significantly. The third one is Exploit Weakness, and the glyph used here is Infusion. Now, normally this is what I use when I had the double imbuement dip, so both, the poison and the shadow, but it's still useful because it further increases the damage of your imbuement skill. So this is going to help quite a bit with that, and it also resets the cooldown of your other imbuments if you want to switch, Poison Trap to maybe like the poison. Meanwhile, the fourth one, we went with the Eldritch Bounty. This one also got a slight buff in the new update, so now its effect, which makes it so that when you attack with an imbuement skill, you gain a 20% resistance and a 20% increased damage to that imbuement element for 9 seconds. And I believe this was 5 seconds previously, or maybe 6, I can't really remember, but now it lasts for a bit longer. So this means essentially that it's going to be useful on your second cast of the Shadow Imbuement. But here I'm using the Ranger Glyph so that this increases our marksman skill damage, and it helps a bit with some of that damage mitigation as we use or wield ranged weapons with us. The fifth and final one is going to be the Tricks of the Trade, and in this one we're going to use Ambush so that we can increase our damage against enemies affected by our trap skills. And this is going to be quite helpful since this build relies on those a lot. Plus, we have some additional damage to distant enemies over here and other ways to increase our damage, our armor, and there's even a rare node over here like the Havoc, which further increases our physical damage and critical strike damage too. Now, I do have some final thoughts on this build and some of the rogue changes because it feels that every time Blizzard says they nerf things in the name of promoting build diversity, they actually achieve quite the opposite. So even now, these stats that they nerfed like vulnerable and critical damage only forces us to focus on them even more since they still continue to be the most desirable and the strongest. It's just that you need a lot more of them to continue to be viable. So this means that builds that weren't top performers before will drop off even more now compared to those cookie cutter setups that were always god tier. And by no means Penetrating Shot was OP or broken, it was just a good, solid, viable option, a fun option to use if you ever got bored playing the same old Twisting Blade variants. So it just feels that the build dropped a little bit in ranking because of these stat changes that the build was already struggling with before. So hopefully there's going to be some other changes to compensate for that, but I'm also going to test out some of the other builds and see if it's worth switching. Also looking for some other ranged options in there to look at and like just maybe find an alternative. So stay tuned for that if you want to see that, and maybe some other builds to help you in Season 1. This is it. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.